The 80s were an amazing time and era for comedy movies. Between the 1970s and 1980s, considering beta and VHS and other means of recording movies in your own home and replaying them in your own home, we've seen the ante upped, so to speak, for various movies to have a higher level of rewatch value. Being one who grew up in the 80s with VHS, I look back at my childhood with very fond memories, watching these various movies over and over again as I grew up. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I am TheAmazingFlec, and today we're going to talk about timeless comedy movies of the 1980s. Oh, and a little bit of context. If you're new to my channel, I'm currently on break during a 16-hour shift at work using the treadmill in the basement filming this video. I promised my viewers I'd post every single day, and I'm honoring that promise right here, right now. So with all that being considered, let's get started, shall we? In the year 1980, a movie called Blues Brothers came out, as well as Caddyshack, and another one called Airplane. Now, as a young man watching these three films, I can say that I watched Caddyshack and Airplane probably the most out of all three. I did see Blues Brothers a couple of times too, and I thought it was a wonderful film. John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, classic combination. But out of all three of those, one of them seems to be most timeless to me, meaning one that has the most rewatch value and appeals to a broader audience. Of those three, I think that the movie Airplane has to take the cake on this one. I mean, just with Lloyd Bridges and Leslie Nielsen alone, it made the movie worth watching. But all of the wonderful, silly, comedic antics, slapstick humor, ridiculousness in general, that movie was just over-the-top ridiculous. And they just don't make movies like that anymore. I don't think they can, in fact. So Airplane takes the cake for the 1980 most timeless comedy movie. Now, keeping in mind there were a lot of other movies that came out in 1980, I'm picking movies that I felt were very popular and had a broader appeal and still have a lot of timelessness and rewatch value to them even to this day. In 1981, we had Stripes, History of the World Part 1, as well as The Great Muppet Caper. Stripes was a pretty funny movie featuring Bill Murray and also a couple other scenes that I remember watching over and over again as a young man on the VHS cassette, and maybe getting in trouble by my parents for doing that. History of the World Part 1, Mel Brooks, a genius. Wonderful movie, very, very funny. Arguably probably the most classic one out of all three of these on the list. And the most timeless because it has to do with history, right? However, The Great Muppet Caper can be easily overlooked by adults. As a young man growing up with that, I thought the movie was just absolutely hilarious with all the different Muppets and their various characterizations. However, watching it again as an adult, I saw all the subtle jokes inside of it that I just completely missed as a young boy watching this film. I have to say, out of the three of those films, the two that are probably the most rewatchable and are still funny to this day, I'd have to say it's either History of the World Part 1 or The Great Muppet Caper. I'm gonna have to go with The Great Muppet Caper just because it really pulls on my heartstring, and I really do feel that there is something in that movie for everyone of all ages. History of the World Part 1 has jokes in there that kids might not understand or certain people just wouldn't get, or it doesn't gel well with them. But The Great Muppet Caper has a lot more classic humor that can resonate with just about anybody. 1982 was pretty tough for me because I couldn't find very many comedy movies that were very popular for that year. I mean, think about it. If you're familiar with 1980s, and specifically 1982, how many comedy movies can you name from there? Well, fortunately here in the O's and the 2000s and 2020s, we have access to the internet and a vast library of information out there. So I looked it up, and I found that we had a movie called The Toy starring Richard Pryor. Pretty good film. I watched that in the 90s on Comedy Central when they showed a bunch of movies on Comedy Central. Airplane Part 2, the sequel. It was pretty good, but not nearly as funny as Airplane 1. A movie called Porky's, classic college humor movie starring young misogynistic men chasing after ladies, peering through holes in the wall where they can see it all. And of course, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, a classic coming-of-age story growing up as a teenager in America in the 1980s. And those are four movies from 1982 that I recall seeing as a young man. And of the four of them, I think the one that's most relatable and the most timeless, has the most broad appeal, would have to be Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I mean, Sean Penn's in it, and a couple other actors. I'm gonna catch hell from some people who are sincere 1980s movie enthusiasts over this video, I'm sure. But 1983 happened, and that was a wonderful year for many reasons, one of which was I was born. And we also had some decent movies coming out that time, too. We did see National Lampoon's Vacation, classic Chevy Chase film. I'm a fan of most of the National Lampoon's films starring Chevy Chase and his family. Monty Python's Meaning of Life was very, very funny, but I think only if you really appreciate Monty Python and or British humor. So if that wasn't your thing, then you might not find it so funny and maybe even confusing at times, and at other times quite uncomfortable to watch. And Cheech and Chong's Still Smokin'. Cheech and Chong Still Smokin' is obviously kind of a niche comedy film, catering specifically to the stoner comedy community. But National Lampoon's Vacation seems to be quite a timeless film and has a good amount of rewatch value, at least for me, and for a lot of other people that I know who appreciate Chevy Chase movies. But in 1984, things really amped up. And this was a really good year for comedy movies in the 80s, in my humble opinion. Not only did we have Revenge of the Nerds, not only did we have This Is Spinal Tap, we also had Gremlins, Police Academy, but we also had a wonderful little film, you might have heard of it, called Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters was a staple of mine growing up. As a child, I watched that one a lot on VHS. And just a couple days ago, I watched Ghostbusters again, and that movie still holds up. It is funny. If you haven't seen the original Ghostbusters from 1984, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Talk about timeless humor. I mean, the antics between Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray and all the other actors in there. Ernie Hudson, Sigourney Weaver, Rick Moranis, Harold Ramis as Egon. The cast was absolutely wonderful, the movie was spot on, and I think that Ghostbusters deserves the spot in 1984. Oh, a fun fact about the music. Did you know that Huey Lewis and the News was supposed to do the score for Ghostbusters? But Huey Lewis and the News wanted way too much dinero in order to do the song. So instead, they asked Ray Parker Jr. to do the song, and he agreed. Now we have that song stuck in our head with Ray Parker Jr.'s voice for all eternity. So yeah, 1984 was an amazing year for comedy movies. I mean, I'm not even going to mention Bachelor Party, The Toxic Avenger, Splash, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, The Muppets Take Manhattan. But considering all those movies, I think Ghostbusters deserves the #1 spot in the most timeless comedy movie of 1984. Now, 1985 happens. What happened in 1985? I believe that's when we went Back to the Future. I was waiting to say that. Back to the Future was another one of those flicks I grew up watching over and over again as a young man. And it wasn't until I was in middle school when I first saw the movie Clue. And that movie is absolutely hilarious. If you haven't seen Clue, I highly recommend watching that one. But we also had the movie Goonies in 1985 too. This makes this decision very, very difficult for me already. But on top of that, we also had a little movie called Weird Science. Absolutely hilarious, and just overall a feel-good movie. Very, very campy. It makes this year a little difficult for me to pick, but if I had to pick something, I kind of have to pick the movie Clue because out of all of them, I think it's the most timeless, it has the most rewatch value, and for all those reasons, I think Clue deserves the #1 spot for the most timeless comedy movie of 1985. It definitely has the most rewatch value. And then 1986 came creeping along, and we saw movies like The Money Pit, Three Amigos, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Short Circuit, Crocodile Dundee, Howard the Duck, a really, really bad movie called Troll. I grew up watching the movie Troll way too much. It's horrible. I recommend you don't watch it. We even had a John Cusack film called One Crazy Summer starring Demi Moore. My first childhood crush was from that movie on Demi Moore. And we have Big Trouble in Little China, a movie that did absolutely horrible at box office, but turned out to be a cult classic in years to come. And last but not least, we have a movie called Little Shop of Horrors starring Rick Moranis, and Bill Murray stars as the masochistic dental patient. It was a really good flick. Definitely a musical, so some people don't really appreciate that. But out of all the comedy films that came out in 1986 that I'm aware of, I think that the most timeless one, that has the most rewatch value, would have to be Little Shop of Horrors. I mean, I was really partial to picking Big Trouble in Little China, but it's kind of campy and I don't think that one's necessarily for everyone. Not to say that Little Shop of Horrors is for everyone else, but I think it has a broader appeal. And then another year around the sun in 1987 happened. Here we saw the movies to the likes of Spaceballs, The Princess Bride, Harry and the Hendersons, and Good Morning Vietnam. So to pick one out of all these movies was pretty hard for me because I was caught between Spaceballs and The Princess Bride. But out of all of them, I think it has to go with The Princess Bride. I've always said that The Princess Bride had such a broad appeal and it had something for everyone. Action, adventure, romance, all that stuff. And I hear more people quoting The Princess Bride than I hear them quoting Spaceballs. So The Princess Bride will take the #1 slot for 1987. And then 1988 happened. No one saw it coming. Here we saw Big Top Pee-wee, The Naked Gun, a movie called Young Einstein starring a fellow by the name of Yahoo Serious. I grew up watching this one and I like it a lot and I still like it. I still think it's a pretty clever movie. It plays around with history and mixing up facts and plays on words. And it's really, really, really ridiculous. And I think by many metrics and standards, just a bad movie overall. But it holds a place in my heart. But anyways, it's not going to take the #1 slot here because it's not very relatable to a mass audience. But we also had Beetlejuice and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I have to say, I rewatched Who Framed Roger Rabbit just a few years ago. And to watch it as an adult and to see all the subtle, nuanced adult humor that you missed as a child was really, really entertaining. Wonderful cast, great acting, amazing animation mixed with real-life actors. Yeah, I think for 1988, I think Who Framed Roger Rabbit wins the #1 slot. Lots of rewatch value, fun for the whole family. Then, 1989, we had Batman, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Weekend at Bernie's. I try to stick away from Part 2 movies because they're usually pretty cheesy, but we had Ghostbusters 2 that came out, which was pretty good, in my opinion. Not nearly as good as the first. And Back to the Future 2, which was pretty good, but not as good as the first. And I think we had Police Academy 17 come out around that point. There were so many Police Academy movies, it was ridiculous. Actually, it was just Police Academy 6, but you get the idea. Considering that whole list of movies, though, I think the one that's the most relatable, has the most broad appeal, and the most rewatch value would have to be Batman. Even if you're not into superhero movies, Batman has something to offer everyone, I feel. And to recap, in 1980 we had Airplane, 1981 The Great Muppet Caper, 1982 Fast Times at Ridgemont High, 1983 National Lampoon's Vacation, 1984 Ghostbusters, 1985 Clue, 1986 Little Shop of Horrors, 1987 The Princess Bride, 1988 Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and 1989 Batman. When I was researching all these movies from the 80s, I had a couple other movies in my mind that I thought might have been from the 80s, but it turns out they just barely missed being in the 80s. So a couple of honorable mentions. 1978, Animal House, if you're into those college humor kind of movies. And 1979, The Jerk, starring Steve Martin. The Jerk was an amazing movie. If you haven't seen it and you haven't heard of it, you gotta check it out. It'll make you chuckle at least a couple times. And in 1990, we had Dick Tracy, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Home Alone, and Kindergarten Cop, which was alright, but not that great. Out of all those, I think Home Alone probably takes the #1 slot, but I'm gonna have to pick Dick Tracy because if you haven't seen that one still holds up really well. And another honorable mention from 1991 was a movie called Nothing But Trouble, starring Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, Chevy Chase, and Demi Moore, my childhood crush. I could have swore that one was released in the 1980s, but I guess not. It was released in 1991. Oh yeah, and a fun fact about Nothing But Trouble. It stars the first ever appearance of Tupac Shakur in any Hollywood movies. He was very young and part of Humpty Dumpty's Digital Underground crew in that movie. So if you haven't seen Nothing But Trouble, check that one out. That one's pretty good, and I think it still holds up to this day too. So the 1980s were a crazy time in film in general, and a great time for comedy movies. I have many fond memories, as I said earlier, watching all these different films growing up, and it made me happy to share the ones that I felt really stood out more so over all the other ones. So what do you think I messed up with my assessments? What movies did I miss? Which ones do you think would have been better than the ones that I picked? Leave a comment below. I'd really love to know what anyone out there has to think about this list and what I have to say about these movies. Oh yeah, also, if you're new to my channel, please know that I post every single day here on YouTube. And every week I post another tutorial on something to do with the circus and flow arts. So if you want to learn how to juggle, or contact juggle, like David Bowie did in that movie The Labyrinth, or spin things on your finger, like trays or books, or learn how to use the devil sticks, then hey, maybe you might want to check out my playlist section, look up the circus and flow arts tutorials, and see if anything there gels with you. Alright everyone, I appreciate you watching here today. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you take the opportunity to watch any one of those top movies I suggested. I really feel like they're all timeless and they have something to offer most everyone who does watch them. So this is where I leave you folks. Until next time, remember to keep safe, be well, stay humble, and peace.